need credits or would like a credit, since you're putting in a lot of time watching these that are webinars, you can still register at NNU, and the information it will be sent out, has been sent out with each of our recorded sessions. So enjoy tonight. I'm excited about it because I'm working with little girls that handwriting is something hard to read. So we'll see how this goes tonight. Thank you, Kristen, sorry.
That's good. Thank you, ladies. Robin and the Decoding Dyslexia Idaho team. I so enjoyed being with your group for your virtual conference, and I just know that that was a great success. And then these October webinars, I commend you in the pursuit for awareness and advocacy and developing knowledge, skills, and dispositions. So hopefully that's what we're going to endeavor to do tonight as we look at how cursive writing develops thinking abilities and literacy skills couched within the framework of how do we get a grip on dysgraphia. You know, Robin, you note the hour of this presentation. Certainly those joining us tonight, you've probably had a long day teaching, parenting, you're ready to rest and relax. So we're going to stay cognitively engaged and active with one another. But a quick story, I do a lot of presentations, and much of the work is international as well. And we have a large group in India, and I was working with them, and they asked me to present a conference, and the times got completely swapped. And so it's probably about midnight. And back then, this was, you know, maybe 8 years ago, we still had a home phone, and the home phone starts ringing, and my husband says to me, "Are you expecting anybody? Is everything okay?" And no, we just don't answer the phone. Finally, after about the fourth call back, we answer the phone, and it's India asking, "We're ready for the presentation. We've got about 500 educators here waiting for you." By this time, it's 12:30 midnight my time. So I said, "Please give me 15 minutes. And don't you love Zoom? You dress from the top up, right? And then from the bottom down." So I just had to make sure that that camera was angled right where it needed to be. So 8 o'clock feels like early bird time. So we are ready to roll tonight. So thank you. So let's take a look first about how does handwriting develop within the context of brain development. So we know that in order to develop handwriting skills, a critical skill of visual motor integration has to occur. And really what happens here is that the long fibers in the brain have to myelinate. And by that, it's that fatty sheath that covers these nerve fibers, these dendrites. And what happens is this myelinization has to go from the motor cortex, which is fairly high up, all the way down to the student's fingertips. What's important to remember about myelinization is that it can begin as early as age 3, and in rare instances, myelinization might not be complete until age 7. So I hope you're beginning to ask yourself as an educator, as a parent, what are the learning implications for that broad, developmentally normal range from age 3 to 7 before myelinization is fully complete? So initially, learning handwriting begins in the parietal cortex. We know this is where primary motor strips. We know this is where sort of the seat in the brain for where this motor coordination and initiating motor task begins. But once it develops automaticity, once handwriting becomes automatic, it then is transitioned from the parietal cortex to the cerebellum, just kind of sitting right there under the cortex. So learning handwriting is really a top-down process. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about gender developmental differences in brain development. If you are a mom and you've been pregnant, you know that that 20-week mark is kind of that midway point in gestation. Well, guess what? At 20 weeks, there is well-established research that there is a 20% differential between girls' brain development and boys' brain development. So much so that girls are 20% ahead of boys by the 20th week of gestation in their brain development. That differential in developmental differences continues, so that by the time boys and girls enter into kindergarten, girls are 1 year ahead of boys in brain development. So what does that mean for handwriting development? Well, there's very much in education today this downward extension of the curriculum. Let's push the curriculum down into the lower and lower grades so that parents are expected to have their child recognizing letters by the time they come into kindergarten, writing a few letters of their name, or even writing their name. No longer is it that you come into kindergarten and you're learning letters, you're just beginning to learn to read. In this downward extension of the curriculum, we've got pretty high expectations for our littles who haven't even yet potentially myelinated their dendrites and these nerve fibers that are connecting these impulses from the motor cortex down to the fingertips. And what happens is that if we begin handwriting instruction too early, children won't develop the appropriate muscles for handwriting. And what ends up happening is that handwriting, rather than stabilizing the hand and the fingertips, becomes hands and arms, because those are the gross motor movements that have developed. And they're not able to signal their fingers because that myelinization hasn't occurred. I want to actually read to you something that Dr. Denkla stated in one of the courses that I took in just understanding developmental differences, brain differences. Dr. Denkla, well-known researcher, clinician, child developmental psychologist. And here's what she says. If educators insist that everybody at age 4 writes his or her name and the alphabet, you end up with children who are not really using the proper muscles to write, and who write essentially with their hands or their arms, but they're not able to give the signals to their fingers, which is the most efficient way to be writing, with your fingertips. And we'll talk about pencil grip and why the pincer grip is the most efficient grip, because, and we'll hold it for later, but we want to make sure that students are writing with that proper pencil grip, just as then stabilizing the hand to use their fingertips to write. So brain development and handwriting development go hand in hand. So now that we've looked at brain development, those underlying systems, structure and function, let's take a look at the cognitive components of writing. We know that graphomotor is an important skill. Graphomotor deals with pencil grip. You want to teach your students, just like this image shows of this pincer grip, where their writing utensil is resting in that V, the fleshy part between their thumb and their index finger. We talk with our young children about make that mountain slope in your index finger, your pointer finger, where it's a sharp up. There are the most sensitive aspect of your finger, your hands, is in your index pointer, right on this pad right here. And that gives the most neurological feedback to your brain. And it's actually when your hand is most relaxed, when you're holding in that pincer grasp of the pencil grip. So developing pencil grip and forming letters. But guess what? Graphomotor and that pencil grip doesn't happen by holding a pencil early, even by holding a fat crayon and some of those what we think are developmental, or we are told are developmentally appropriate utensils. What develops the proper muscles for correct pencil grip is palm strength. So get your littles commando crawling on the ground, working through obstacle courses, jumping rope, doing everything they can, playing outdoors on different playground materials so that they can strengthen their palm strength, because that's what will enable them to have correct motor grip.
Kristen, I wonder if now might be a good time for a couple questions in the chat box. One came up, could this also be why we see that boys are being referred to OT in kindergarten?
Absolutely.
And how should that affect curriculum?
Yes. So we do see an over referral based on gender differences. If you think about that, a year behind in kindergarten in comparing the female versus the male brain development. And so helping your parents and your educators to be aware. The SLPs, all, typically know this, the OTs, and just getting that message out. So when you think of curriculum, kindergarten should be a lot of play-infused learning, developmentally appropriate play where they're exploring their world using gross motor movements and engaging in learning. So maybe it means you've got clothespins and you've got name boards for everybody. And on the clothespins, you write the letter of each child's name, and they're taking the clothespins and they're matching it to their letters on the name board. So you're strengthening that fine motor grip, you're getting that recognition with the symbols and the letters, but again, you're not requiring them to hold a skinny short pencil in hands that just developmentally aren't ready for it.
And how about developmentally appropriate writing tools? Does the size of the pencil make a difference?
In the hands of littles, using a oversized pencil is fine. Even if you want to use some of the pencil grips, and that's individually stylistic for you as an educator, a parent, an OT, the student. There's lots of choices out there that work, but what you want to do is to get large motor movements. So if you're putting writing utensils in the hands of students, have them be bigger, a little thicker to hold onto, but not writing on small lines. So they're writing on the big whiteboards. You've got poster papers that they're writing on, and they're practicing these large motor movements, again, strengthening that motor hand, eye-hand coordination to when we will then move to that fine motor coordination.
And would you say a squeeze toy would strengthen the palm?
Absolutely. Any of those stretch bands that you have, yes, those stress balls can do that as well.
Okay, and lastly, how would you say to do hands-on activities while in COVID when we have a class of 20 students that need all their own materials?
Yeah, that's tough for sure. So thinking about their bins or tubs that they just learn, this is my space, my equipment, and this is kind of the sandbox that I play in and use. You as the educator, you're probably going to have to shift use of gloves, have them in your pocket as you're going, but do a lot of modeling. And when you need to, do hand over hand, where you're physically showing them how to hold a pencil, where you're physically helping them to move to form some of those letters. Always starting with manuscript first, but we're going to talk about that too as we get into some of the curriculum. Okay, so we keep going. So here's what I want you to do as we think about graphomotor, and just to help reinforce how much of a motor skill handwriting becomes. What I'd like for you to do, please, is to write your full name, your first, middle, and last name. So not your signature, but your full name in your best cursive handwriting. So if you've got a piece of paper there, a utensil to write with, first, middle, and last name. Now, some of you may be thinking, gosh, it's been a long time since I've written cursive. How do I form that letter? Or I've sort of stylistically changed what I was taught with cursive handwriting, and I've adopted my own style of cursive writing. Absolutely fine. But what I'd like for you to do now is position your writing utensil on a line that's under where you just wrote your full name. You're going to write your name again, but this time, please close your eyes while you're writing your name. So go ahead and try. All right, I can see by Dr. Zadel's eyes, she's up and ready to go. What I'd like you to do is put in the chat box, please. What do you notice in the comparison between the two samples of how you signed your name? Oh, bigger. No, don't be hindered by hand over hand help. That's good. The second one was slightly slanted, so much smaller, just about the same. Words were closer, not too bad, drifting down. Good, smaller and wider. Not much different, slightly smaller. Basically, what you're saying is that it has become a motor memory for you, handwriting. You don't have to think about forming the letters. It's deeply coded and embedded in your process from your parietal lobe down to your cerebellum, being able to control that graphomotor skill. We want to help our students develop that automaticity and fluidity with handwriting. So when we think about processing speed and automaticity, handwriting also involves the ability to process phonological information. We'll talk about how and why, orthographic information, motor, and memory. We also need to have working memory, short-term memory, and long-term retrieval. With working memory, this plays into how students remember spelling, storing auditory information for the sequencing of sounds, spatial planning. Some of you noted when you closed your eyes, it was drifting downward, the slant was a little bit different. And then orthographic, we're talking here about the sequence of letters. Our orthographic memory is this template of the visual word until it's actually written. Executive functions also play a big role in components of writing. We have to have students be attending to what they're writing. We have to have them thinking through about the organization, planning behavior. I have this many words to fit on the line, or maybe I only write 2 words very large and I've used up my whole line. So that self-regulation, that monitoring is important with writing as well. And then language, the vocabulary we're going to use, the sentence structure, the syntax that is involved, all of these are the cognitive components of writing. So before we get into the developmental stages of writing, let me just pause and see if there are any more questions about brain development or the cognitive components of writing. Okay, then let's keep going. So although the date on this is from 1993, from materials that I have read, this is probably the most succinct version from Dr. Mel Levine of what does it mean for writing developmental stages at the different grade levels. So as you're thinking about curriculum, as you're thinking about what is appropriate and should be expected for students, and I'll just kind of go through each one of these. Preschool to first grade, we know that pretend writing is great. Let the children scribble. Let them play and explore creatively with what it feels like to develop this skill set. But then you want to help them to become aware that letters can be arranged to form words. They begin to organize letters. Sequencing letters of the alphabet is great. Sequencing shapes in a line is wonderful. Have an example of a sequence of a circle, a square, a triangle, and then repeat your sequence, a circle, and then underneath, see if the students can match that. And then they're beginning to maybe print some letters and some numbers. As we move from first to second grade, they become more adept at printing letters. This is when students often become preoccupied with, how does my writing look? Doesn't it look pretty? Isn't it neat? But they can also become self-conscious of their penmanship if it's less attractive than their peers. Students often during this stage use inventive spellings of words pretty liberally. You want to, as much as possible, reinforce and show them the correct spelling of the words. The more that students are seeing invented spelling, the more it becomes embedded in their thinking. So you really want to celebrate their practice and trial of spelling, but then provide the model or the example of, oh, you wanted to spell the word look. Here it is, and you write it for them, and if they're capable, they imitate that, they repeat it. Then in late second to fourth grade, they're beginning to do some mechanics of writing. So capitalization, punctuation, syntax, and some grammar. One of the things that we like to teach our students starting about grade 3 is this idea of caps. It's just a mnemonic to help students think about their standards of writing. And CAPS stands for capitalization. Oh my goodness, I just went a blank for an A, punctuation and spelling. So I'll come back to what the A is, but the capitalization, punctuation, and spelling are really important. And then the A, that's just somebody can help me out with that one as to what it is. But think of a mnemonic for them. Is it appropriate? Maybe it's the syntax and the grammar. Does it match and align for them? They seldom plan in 2nd to 4th grade. There's not a lot of planning behavior. Think about executive function and when that develops and comes online. They seldom plan what they're going to write before they write it. It's just sort of this conscious stream of thought. And then I did this, and then I did that, and then we had dessert, and then we ate ice cream. They often use their writing to relate experiences. They'll tell about a party or a vacation they went on, rather than writing to solve a problem or to develop ideas. Certainly in late 2nd grade, you can begin to teach cursive, begin writing in cursive, and then usually during this grade level, they're beginning to revise their work as well. So as we continue on, 4th to 7th grade, they're applying the rules of grammar and spelling automatically. They're beginning to review their own work, and you might give them one of the mnemonics or a device to help them in how they review their own work. I encourage you, when you're helping students learn to edit their work, you review the sentence with them, and if you find an error, simply put a dot in the left margin for every sentence that you find an error, and help the student discover their own error. Label it, say what went wrong and what they need to do to fix it. Also, there's lots of oral language resources out there where there are sentences that have mistakes in them, and students have to identify the mistakes and correct them. And certainly you can create your own sample sentences and paragraphs as well. What's interesting here in this transition, usually late 4th, early 5th is when you start to see it come online for a lot of students, is they begin to write at a level equivalent to their speech. See, there's oral vocabulary and written vocabulary. They learn to write in stages. They're beginning to use outlines and multiple drafts. And then they can start to do some of that self-monitoring where they're evaluating, well, this was supposed to be a persuasive paragraph. Was I effective in being persuasive? Or this was an opinion paragraph. Did I share my opinion or did I borrow a fact? 7th to 9th grade, they're really becoming adept at expressing a viewpoint. This is where you also have the opportunity to help them begin to see others' viewpoints and write it from someone else's perspective. They're also beginning to write for thinking and problem solving and remembering, synthesizing ideas. They can exceed their speech with their written language. They can learn to use a thesaurus to look up what are synonyms and antonyms. And they're starting to use these connective or cohesive and transition devices, words such as finally, or for example. And then once we get up to 9th grade and beyond, writing styles that are appropriate for their subjects. So in science, I'm going to use a different writing style than maybe I would use in history or in language arts. They tend to become more creative with their writing. They're varying their sentence length and complexity. A great activity to do from 4th grade up, once they're learning the parts of speech, is to have a parts of speech jar and just the labels of parts of speech on little cards. And they draw out 5 different cards. And they put those cards in order of how they drew them out. And then they have to create a sentence based upon, say they drew out adjective, noun, verb, infinitive, whatever those parts of speech are. And they're creating a sentence that is grammatically correct and conveys a meaning. Learning to use sentences with a variety of length and complexity, using more sophisticated vocabulary. And yes, they will develop their individual writing styles. It's a whole other conversation as to what technology is doing to handwriting. We're going to touch on a little bit about the differences between keyboarding and cursive handwriting and areas in the brain and language and reading and what gets activated. But the writing styles of our students are impacted, and they have since civilization began developing based upon the tool that they're using. So when we went from an oral civilization that just retold our stories to one that was using stylus and papyrus. Then our stories became shorter for efficiency. When we moved from handwriting to typewriting, that efficiency created even shorter, a different style of writing. And now that we're doing texting and tweeting and hashtagging, we have a completely different style of writing. So we want to make sure that our students, and here's the key, Dr. Virginia Berninger is one of the leading researchers in the US. She's near you guys. She's out at Washington State, or University of Washington, excuse me. She talks about helping students become multilingual by hand. So multilingual by hand, keyboarding, cursive writing, manuscripting, texting, helping students to be appropriate in their writing skills by hand, whatever the implementer technology that's being used. So just a brief overview of how writing developmental stages across the grade levels. So let's take a look then. As we move to, we've looked at the brain-based development of handwriting. We've looked at the cognitive structures. We've looked at sort of the scope and sequence of writing development. Let's now take a look at the definition or definitions of dysgraphia. When we look at IDA, International Dyslexia Association's definition of dysgraphia, it is the condition of impaired letter writing by hand. And so what does this mean in terms of difficulties? Well, learning the formation of letters as well as numbers, illegible or inconsistent handwriting, the speed at which students write the text, their ability to learn to spell words, and then this combination, really relying on working memory, thinking and writing at the same time. What does the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual say about dysgraphia? Well, they term it, in the DSM-5, there's no specific label or category for dysgraphia. It is labeled as a specific learning disability, so under that SLD umbrella, with an impairment in written expression. So it's really looking at, and really within the DSM-5, it's really looking at more trouble at expressing thoughts in writing versus some of the difficulty with the transcription of writing. So not so much hard to read or illegible handwriting, but more getting your thoughts in writing that's organized, that can communicate an idea. What do we know about the prevalence of dysgraphia? Well, we know based on some pretty solid research that anywhere from 7 to 15% of the school-age population has a diagnosis, or would be, if they were tested, to have a diagnosis of dysgraphia. I want to recommend a book to you, and you can see Pfeiffer here is one of the references. Steve Pfeiffer is a neuropsychologist on the East Coast, written a lot of books, and this one particular one that I'm recommending to you is called The Neuropsychology of Written Language Disorders. And he touches on interventions, key strategic approaches to developing handwriting. But what I appreciate about Dr. Pfeiffer's work in this particular book is that he looks at dysgraphia and really categorizes them into 3 main buckets. The first one he calls graphomotor dysgraphia. This is really the dysgraphia where students struggle with the output, the physical act of writing. The physical act of writing involves a wide range of motor skills, from planning to organizing to guiding the hand to automaticity and transcribing thoughts and ideas onto paper. So students with graphomotor dysgraphia will demonstrate visual motor integration difficulties. And let me explain that for a minute. Probably the best way to explain that is a story that a student once told me. He was a young man, he was about a 3rd grader. And I said to him, I said, Adam, I said, what's the answer to, 4 plus 5? And he solved it and he said, yeah, it's 9, Mrs. Barber. And I said, okay, write the answer. He says, Mrs. Barber, he said, I can see the number 9 in my head, but there's something like a pair of scissors that comes and cuts my arm so that what I see in my head cannot get down to my hand. And so this idea of visual motor integration is coordinating what's seen in the mind's eye with a motor response. So I can't coordinate what I see kind of in this visual spatial scratch pad in my head to actually get my hand to do it and that output response. So in addition to visual motor integration difficulties, there's going to be a slower speed of handwriting. And that penmanship is definitely going to be impacted. Penmanship may be very light. So they're afraid of making mistakes. And if they do it light, maybe you won't see all the letters. Or the penmanship may be very hard because they're not recognizing the amount of pencil pressure. A great strategy for students who have very heavy pencil pressure is to use mechanical pencils with thinner lead, because those pencil leads will break if they're pushing too hard, and it gives them great feedback that that pressure was too hard. Multiple erasers so that they've got holes in their paper from the mistakes that they've made, and multiple erasing to try and get it correct. The second type that Dr. Pfeiffer describes as dysgraphia is dyslexic dysgraphia. These are the students who demonstrate significant spelling difficulties. So two key processing skills are needed for spelling. The first is the ability to hear sounds, that phonological processing. Remember earlier in the presentation, I talked about phonology and how that was so important with writing. You need to be able to hear the sounds. It is the reason for many of your children who, as young children, have had ear infections, that it can impact their spelling. Because if they're not hearing the ending sounds in words, they're going to lose those morphemes at the end, those early developing ed, ing, possessive s. But the second key processing skill is the ability to visualize the sound and the symbol representation of the word. And that's really the orthographic processing. So the phonological processing and the orthographic processing is impaired with students who struggle with a dyslexia type of dysgraphia. And then, last but not least, the executive dysgraphia, where we're involved with the planning, the organizing, and the language rules. This is where paying attention, self-monitoring, assessing what we're writing. Sometimes students have failure to launch with handwriting. Have you ever asked your student if you've given them a writing prompt and they just seem paralyzed and can't begin? Tell me what you're thinking. Fascinating. Some of my students will say, Mrs. Barber, I've got so many ideas, I don't know where to start. Others have said, I've got nothing. It's a blank slate. So there's different types of questioning and cueing depending upon how your students respond to you with this failure to launch or failure to start. So what's important to know is that writing is a complex process. It does require working memory, executive function, and self-regulation. What we need to know here is, what does it look like in the school day setting for our students with dysgraphia? Well, still, children spend nearly 60% of their school day actively engaged in some process of written expression, and or an equivalent of a fine motor activity. Even when we're on virtual schooling and they're keyboarding, there's some process of written expression. Think of all the worksheets that students are engaged in doing. And so difficulties in writing can wreak havoc in the ability to transfer these mental thoughts or inner ideas down onto paper. I think it was the National Commission on Writing wrote a piece that said the cost annually for American businesses because of handwriting mistakes was in the billions of dollars, that people couldn't read sloppy handwriting. Think of how many scripts physicians write that you can't read the type of medicine or their signature that they're scrawled. So handwriting is not an antiquated skill, and we'll talk about why it's still so relevant in 21st century classrooms. But let me pause here. Seems like there's a little bit of chatter on the chat box. Robin, are there any questions that would be best to address now, or should we wait and keep going?
There was one, and Daniel, maybe you want to unmute yourself. I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Okay.
It reads, Google says the capital A in the caps, is it mnemic? I'm not sure how to say it. Kim, can you help me out?
Mnemonic.
Mnemonic. Yes.
Thank you. For proofreading stands for appropriate words. The question
Appropriate
is
word
that-
for the syntax, like we thought. I'm so glad. Thank you for confirming. That's excellent. You know, it's wonderful when we have memory lapses, but we can share on the experiences of others and rely on each other to help us out. That's great. Thank you. Okay.
Sorry, I know it says Daniel. I'm using my son's computer. My name's Trish. I'm OT and excited to be listening, but technically illiterate, so it took me a while to be able to talk.
We're glad you're here, Trish. Thanks for contributing. You've got great experience, so feel free to chime in whenever you would like. So let's talk about why is handwriting important. So here we go. National Commission on Writing says, and I love this, if you decide to print your notes and refer to them later on for consolidation of learning after you get some rest, here would be some of the keywords that I would underline. If students are to make knowledge their own, so they're really owning their knowledge, they must struggle with the details. I think I talked about in the conference, the presentation that I did there, just really looking at dyslexia. There's value in productive struggle, where you're wrestling with something that's difficult, because that's changing the way the brain is perceiving, retaining, and retrieving the information. So if students own the knowledge, they've got to have this productive struggle with the details. They must wrestle with the facts. We live in a knowledge economy. Industrial age is gone. You know, we've moved through these different ages, and we are solidly in a global knowledge economy where facts and details are inundating us, bombarding us all the time. They must wrestle with these facts, rework raw information and concepts that aren't maybe fully understood. And here's the key, into a language they can communicate to someone else. You see, language pulls cognition out of our mouths or out of our hands. In short, if students are to learn, they must write. I think that's powerful. If they're to learn, they must write. We know that writing difficulties can occur by themselves or co-occur with other conditions, reading difficulties, oral language difficulties, and these writing difficulties persist for a long time and affect a sizable number of students. Handwriting is not just a mechanical skill. If you remember anything from tonight's opportunity to be together learning, think back, it's not just a mechanical skill. It is a written language skill at that sub-word level of language, so that they're putting these sounds together to form words, these words together to form sentences, sentences together to form paragraphs. Handwriting is written language, not just a mechanical skill. We're going to see how powerfully handwriting impacts reading, the brain, thinking, and learning. So, why do all students need handwriting instruction? Well, over the past decade, the American public their support for teaching cursive handwriting has pretty significantly diminished as technology increases in our daily life, in our learning, and in teaching. But what we do know is that since the widespread adoption of the Common Core standards that have removed the requirement to teach cursive handwriting, teachers in the classroom aren't teaching it as much. But let's take a look at some of this research that talks about why writing is so important for the brain, for learning, and for reading. So writing, according to Dr. Virginia Berninger, is fundamentally literacy by hand. If you strip everything away, it's literacy by hand. It's a crucial component in setting up brain systems to develop reading. Laura Deinhardt is a researcher at Florida International University, and she did a longitudinal study with 4-year-olds. And she looked at the handwriting of 4-year-olds And then as second graders, she examined their reading abilities and found a very strong correlation for 4-year-olds who had strong, clear penmanship. They also had much higher reading abilities and skills. So there's a correlation between handwriting and reading. What we also know that recent neuroscientific research has said that this neural circuitry developed through cursive handwriting influences letter and word reading comprehension as well as spelling. So teaching cursive handwriting is going to impact decoding skills, encoding skills, and reading comprehension. What was fascinating to me is some of the more recent research that's looked at fMRI studies, scans of people engaging in keyboarding and in cursive handwriting. And what they have found is that keyboarding and handwriting are not synonymous. Yes, we need keyboarding. We have to be functionally literate in keyboarding and those skills. But what happens in the brain, activation patterns, significant language areas in the brain are activated when individuals are engaged in cursive handwriting, in those repeated strokes, compared to the keyboarding, which is more sort of a forward and back movement. So significant language processing areas of the brain, areas that respond to reading comprehension tasks. So engaging students in cursive handwriting develops memory, language, and thinking skills very differently than what keyboarding does. So when we think about these sort of sequential finger movements, thinking and working memory is improved. But what we also know is that it affects critical thinking and literacy skills. What I love about this is that when young students, when second, third, and fourth graders were taught cursive handwriting, compared to those who wrote in keyboarding, those who were taught cursive handwriting wrote more words, stronger vocabulary words, and wrote lengthier sentences than those who keyboarded, which is sort of counterintuitive because we think keyboarding is just much more efficient and we can move our fingers quickly across the keyboard. But if you go back to, it's the brain that's engaging language and memory and thinking when you're doing cursive writing, it makes sense. You're more fluid with your thinking, you can avail yourself of more vocabulary, and that continuous movement allows for that continuous process of thinking. What's interesting as well is that there was a study of college students. So, okay, does cursive handwriting just impact K-12 students? So there was a study comparing college students and the types of lecture notes that they took, cursive handwriting compared to keyboarding. And what they found is that students who had the handwriting notes compared to typed or keyboard notes outperformed their students on tests of retention and higher level thinking and comprehension. And so I see some of your heads nodding. It just makes sense. If that information is becoming more deeply encoded into the brain, it's going to be able to be retrieved better, and it's going to be able to be understood better. So students who are unable to take notes and write papers at the grade appropriate level fall behind not only in note taking, but also in comprehension, which then just sets up this negative learning cycle for students to not want to take notes, to then fall further behind and just become very frustrated with the process. Go one more slide and then pause for some questions here. So what should teachers know regarding teaching handwriting? You do want to teach manuscript before cursive. Developmentally, that's appropriate. By the time students are hitting the end of second grade, sometimes beginning of third grade, depending upon your school context, begin to introduce cursive. You don't have to spend hours doing it. 20 to 30 minutes daily is sufficient. Once as you're teaching all the letters, and after all the letters are taught, then daily, about 5 to 10 minutes review of the letter formation may be sufficient. Always attend to your students' posture, their pencil grip, and their position of the writing surface. In the posture, we talk about our students being ready to be a writer. And by that, it's 90, 90, 90. So feet are flat on the floor at an angle, 90 degrees, bent up to their knees, knees to hips, and then the trunk straight up versus, slouched on the table and the head. And, you're in a writing ready position. We've talked about that pencil grip and that pincer grip. And then the position of the writing surface. Slanting the paper, whether you're right-handed or left-handed, does just help with that fluidity of motion. It doesn't have to be an overslant, but you're getting your students to use their non-dominant hand just as that one to sort of guide and hold that paper in place. Do start with those wide lines. Sometimes you can get that wide line paper that's got the dotted lines in between, just to help with the size and the spacing. Again, you're reinforcing gross motor movement, moving slowly down to that smaller fine motor movement. So Mengen and Valet talk about the coordination of visual perception and motor planning movement with the physical sensation of finger and hand movement during cursive writing strengthens neural connection. So we know there's a connection to reading, there's a connection to spelling, there's a connection to comprehension, there's a connection to thinking and language. So I hope a second takeaway from our time together tonight is that yes, handwriting is way more than just a mechanics. It's a significant part of the written language skill, but handwriting also is developing thinking and learning and reading as we encourage our students to develop this skill. So let me pause here and see, Robin, if we have any questions.
I think you answered the one that just popped up, asking if we had any research about when it was the best time to start cursive instruction. Handwriting without tears does not start until 2nd grade. This is a special education teacher that's with us tonight that asked that question, which I think you just addressed. Does it matter if your child or children are still working on writing, or just start if they do not have the first part? And you're welcome to unmute yourself and be interactive in
Absolutely.
your questions here.
Maybe the person who asked that question, if you can give a little more context, I want to make sure that I'm answering it as specifically as possible.
So basically, it's they don't even really have the actual writing down. Like, we're still working on their letters, and we're still working on forming their hand grip and all that stuff. Even the 3rd grader that I have is still working on their the writing, the actual writing of the letters process. Do you push the cursive, or do you just kind of wait on that?
Well, and it's a good question. We're going to back up a little bit and make sure that hand dominance has been established. So you want to make sure that is your student predominantly right-handed or predominantly left-handed? A great way to informally check that, 2 different ways. And if we were together, we would do this in person. But you can take a piece of paper and roll it up, and you're standing in the middle in front of your student, and you just hand them this rolled up piece of paper right at their midline. See which hand they reach with, and then do they go to their right eye? Do they go to their left eye? And you're just watching to see that hand dominance. You can also stand in the middle and toss a ball and just say catch with one hand and see which hand they catch with. So you want to make sure mixed dominance is not a gift in thinking, in learning, or in handwriting. And I'm sure we've all worked with those students who would start writing with their left hand, get to their midline and cross over and switch to their right hand. That is not something that, unless you're an athlete that you're planning to make a career out of that, mixed dominance, just ambidextrousness is just not a skill set in academics that's beneficial. So you want to make sure that hand dominance has been established. Once you've established that, and you've got a 3rd grader who's still learning to print manuscript, and if you've worked for a while with manuscript and it's just not coming along, do try introducing some easy cursive letters. You know, the upstroke for the L is an easy one. Sometimes the humps for an N, so that they're beginning to feel the fluid motion. You can do a lot of activities before you even put the pencil in the hand. You've got a gritty sandbox, and they're drawing with their fingers the letters in the sand, or you've got shaving cream on a mirror and they're writing with shaving cream on it. Our OT friends can give us all kinds of tactile and wonderful ways for students to practice handwriting with or forming the letters without even putting a pencil in their hand. Have them air write. You model and they stand behind you and they're tracing, they're following with. You're doing the hand over hand and helping them to create that motor muscle memory for that letter formation. So I hope did that answer your question about, do we transition from manuscripts to cursive? Was it Taya who was asking that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it did. That's exactly what I needed. In fact, some of the smaller ones I work with in SPED is figuring out dominance, hand dominance.
Yes.
And then the third graders actually, that's a brilliant thing that you said about putting in a little bit of that to see how it works. So thank you. That was great. Thank you.
Good. Other questions?
We do have one. Do you teach cursive on the chalkboards like manuscript with the small sponges?
Ooh, small sponges. Yeah. Anything that you can do to increase the tactile input, that sensory input. Remember, we said that index finger pad has the most neural receptors, where it's then sending, myelinated all the way up to the brain and back and forth. So sponges gives you a lot of tactile feedback. We do at NILD, we really appreciate the value of chalkboard, not because we're antiquated. Yes, the chalk dust gets in computers and, we're using anti-dust or dustless chalk, if such a thing exists. There's lots of ways to get around that. But what happens with chalk on a chalkboard that's very different than a dry erase board, smart board, or a stylus on your device is there's not as great a drag on other surfaces as there is on a chalkboard. And that slight resistance, that slight drag that happens with chalk just gives more of that sensory feedback to the brain of how it feels, that motor motion, that fine motor, graphomotor motion as well. So if you have chalkboard, and chalkboards can be made, you can go out to a Home Depot or Lowe's store and buy the chalkboard paint and spray it on a piece of plywood, although I know plywood's very expensive now, and have students practice on that if you can't purchase them.
Can you share a little bit about why mixed dominance is an issue and what might help establish a hand?
Yeah. So mixed dominance is one of those sort of soft neurological indicators that there's some cross wiring in the brain and how it's processing information and what parts of the sort of loops, those neural loops, are responsible for initiating motor tasks, carrying out the motor tasks. So we really want to help help establish a dominance for handedness. Certainly you can have a different dominance for eye, a different dominance for foot, but for handedness, you want that wiring to be predominantly right-sided. We know that language is in the left hemisphere and the brain is contralateral. So language in the left hemisphere and contralaterally, things cross over into the right hemisphere when you're writing. And so for mixed dominance, it can be they're on the same side, and we just know that in the brain, the most efficient brain processing is when both hemispheres are working together, but that there is a dominant side for the handwriting and for handedness. Otherwise, the brain just gets confused in the motor memories and the muscles and how it's receiving that neurological input.
And what might help establish a dominance?
Yeah, so even from your littles, so you've got a little toddler in a high chair and you are just watching. Put a Cheerio, put your little fruit, your item, whatever it is, in the center of the high chair. Put a sippy cup in the center of the high chair. See which hand they reach for. That's just a spontaneous gesture. Which hand do they self-feed with? And that's a really good indicator of their dominant hand. And so then you just begin to put toys on that side, food on that side, and you're just reinforcing that use of the dominant hand that you see.
And as in older students, you know, any thoughts around kiddos?
Yeah,
that are
so in
struggling with
older
that?
students, having a conversation with them, which one feels easiest? Which one do you sense your brain not having to work as hard? So have that conversation with them. And usually in students who are ambidextrous, they usually have a preference. They've just not thought about it before. And do a couple of different writing tasks, write words, sentence phrases, sentences with both hands and say, which one was easier to complete? Which one were you more efficient? Which one took less effort? Which one did your brain work less hard? And then have those conversations to help guide you and the student towards that dominance.
Okay, and Julie, I'll come back to your question because I know that we're going to get into that later in the presentation. So we had another one come up. An OT one time had said they did not like dry erase for handwriting practice. Thoughts around that?
Dry erase, I would imagine that it probably has to do with that drag and the tactile feedback. It's very hard to control a pen, a dry erase marker on a whiteboard. It's slick, it's fast, your stop and start points are less precise. So I would imagine that's probably the perspective that was influencing that comment.
And here's a little feedback from Trish, the OT that's with us tonight. I think maybe in helping to find a dominant hand, a fun thing to do is to wad up a piece of paper into a ball and have them stand up and throw the ball as hard as they can. Usually they will throw it with the side that should be the dominant.
Excellent.
So that's fun to share. Left-handed students, should they position their paper differently?
Oh, I'm so glad whoever asked that question. Yes, your slant's going to be opposite. So rather than the right-handed slant, you're going to slant to the left side. Left-handers very often develop a hook. I married a left-hander. He has a horrible hook. You know, old habits are hard to change, but they can be changed. And a lot of times left-handers will develop that hook because they're trying to see what they're writing, or they feel like they smudge maybe what they're writing as they're coming across. But you want to gradually train them so that their hand is coming back down, shoulders are relaxed, and that they're moving across without that hook in their hand.
Okay. Julie had asked, what is rhythmic writing? Which I'm very excited and passionate about you sharing. And then also, Taya, do you want to unmute yourself, Taya, again and ask? Oh, good to know about the hook. Thank you. She commented I was going to ask about ambidextrous.
Mm-hmm.
I am, which helps work with each child.
Yeah, certainly having an empathy and understanding is
Right.
always a gift when we work
Right.
with our students.
Can you show how the position of the paper would be with left?
Oh, you're just going to opposite slant, just a little bit of that opposite slant. So you're going to slant it to the left just a little bit as opposed.
Okay, I think that leaves us with Julie's question about rhythmic writing, and maybe we can continue on with the presentation.
Julie, you're taking us right there. Here we go. All right. So I'm showing you some beautiful student examples of individuals doing rhythmic writing. Rhythmic writing is one of the cognitive techniques that we train educational therapists in NILD to use with students who have dysgraphia. Rhythmic writing, and we're going to watch about a 6-minute video of me doing rhythmic writing with a student so you can see it live, recorded. But rhythmic writing, we do 3 different, we call them motifs, 3 different 8s. There's a horizontal 8, a vertical 8, and then the combination of the 2. And again, you'll see this on video. But what's happening during rhythmic writing is the student is standing in the middle of however that 8 is drawn. And they are very carefully, intentionally, systematically tracing the 8 in a particular pattern. As they are tracing the 8, they are labeling the direction that their hand is going. So if I'm standing in front of you and just imagine that a chalkboard was in front of me and there was a vertical 8 in front of me, kind of up to the height of my forehead, down to about, if I was wearing a belt, kind of waist level or a little bit below. And what I would do as I trace the 8, I would say the direction my hand is going. So I would say left, right. And what's happening is as students, they're crossing their midline. They're engaging in a multimodal task of visual motor integration, of language. We're getting working memory and processing speed engaged as well, because as students are tracing the 8, the educational therapist will say, change. The student has to process and perceive that, and then make their hand go in a different direction and say the new direction that their hand is going. We layer one more load on top of that cognitive working memory load to where we also add in mental math. So as the student's standing and tracing the 8, saying the directions, responding to the change command, I might say the product of 8 and 2. They have to keep moving with their hand, mentally in their working memory, hang on to that information, solve the math problem, verbally give a math response, an answer, and keep going with that tracing of the 8. And then in that bottom right-hand corner picture that you see, these are motifs. We have all the letters of the alphabet and the motifs, which are just repeated patterns of how you actually form the cursive letters that students practice. Again, they're standing in the middle of a chalkboard, crossing their midline, going from the left to the right. You'll see in this short video, I comment on the student, he's kind of moving his shoulders. Think about it, when you cross over your midline, let's say you're right-handed and you cross over your midline and you open up that shoulder, your left shoulder, you're never really crossing the midline. But if you keep your shoulder tucked in and pull your arm over, then you are crossing the midline. So there's lots of nuances that go along with rhythmic writing. But rhythmic writing integrates both motor and cognitive functions, like I just talked about. It involves graphomotor skills, working memory, sequencing skills. It significantly improves attention. You know, we had Dr. Russell Barkley. Many of you are probably familiar with Dr. Barkley's work, a lot of work with students with ADHD. And Dr. Barkley came and he watched us doing some rhythmic writing, and he said, wow, he said, if parents knew there was a non-pharmacological way to stimulate attention, working memory, and handwriting, you couldn't keep up with the demand of what's out there. So very definitely improving attention. I had one of my high schoolers say to me, Mrs. Barber, I do rhythmic writing on the morning of days I have tests because it just wakes my brain up. It just makes me sharp and thinking. And what it does is it provides repeated practice with forming letters and the fluidity of handwriting, and it absolutely improves handwriting. In fact, this evening, I'm on a scholarship committee for a young man who unexpectedly died as a young adult, but who was with us in Discovery Program in these doing rhythmic writing practices. And his mom tonight was talking about how when she was a desperate parent looking for help for her son, she sat down and had a conversation with me. And I didn't remember this part of the conversation, but she said, I brought out a student's notebook, 2 notebooks, and I showed her the transformation in his handwriting. This was a young man with dysgraphia, and the transformation from the size of the letters, the formation, the spacing, the spelling, the cursive. It was as if 2 different students had been writing those handwriting samples within the span of about 2 to 3 months. And that was very memorable for her because that was an acute need that she had for her son, Joseph. So rhythmic writing is a powerful tool in the hands of a trained and equipped educational therapist. So let me just show you this short video, and then we can talk about it some more and answer any questions that you might have. Let me stop sharing for just a moment and make sure that I've turned on the computer audio so that you can hear it through the computer audio as well. I'll make sure that that's in play here. Okay. All right. And if the volume is not loud enough, just stop me and we will restart. And again, it's about 6.5 minutes or so. So enjoy. Check your feet position before you begin. Okay, nice relaxed shoulders. Good.
Left, right. Left,
Change,
right,
change.
left,
Double 12.
right. 24. Left,
Change,
right,
change.
left,
The product of 6 and 4.
right. 24.
Direction.
Left, right,
Change.
right,
Think about your direction.
Left.
Come back here.
left,
Good.
right,
Change.
left,
The difference of 13 and 9.
right, left,
Think
4,
about your direction. Which way are you headed now?
right,
There it is. Stop.
4.
Good. Good body position, keeping your left shoulder nice and relaxed and still. Good. I like how you're tracking with your head. Check your feet. Make sure they're even. Good. When you're ready,
Left,
good. Keep that shoulder tucked in when you cross midline.
left,
Strong voice.
right,
Change,
right,
change.
left,
Think about your direction. Which way are you going?
right,
Right, there it is.
left,
Change.
right, left,
Half of 20.
right, 10,
Change,
left, right,
change.
left,
36 divided by 6.
6, left,
Change.
right,
1/4 of a dollar.
right, a quarter.
Stop. Well done. Nice job staying on the lines. Okay, check your feet position. Okay, nice relaxed left shoulder, good tracking with your head, pencil grip looks good. I really like you dropping your elbow, keeping it flat to the board, dropping your elbow and keeping your wrist flat to the board. There you go.
Left, right,
Good head tracking. Pick your speed up just a little bit.
right,
Change.
left, right,
Come back here. And when you're going this way, what is your direction?
right,
Right.
left, right,
Change.
left,
0 times 21.
0,
Direction.
left, right,
Good.
left, right,
Change.
right,
Think about it. Which way are you going?
Left.
Left. Shoulder in. Direction.
right, left,
Good. You were much better with the timing of that
Right.
direction. And now you're going
left,
left. Stretch all the way across to midline. Track with your head.
right,
Change.
left, right, left,
17 and 17.
right, left, 34, left,
What's your direction?
right,
Good. Stop. Okay, what card do you see there?
card 3,
Card 3. What letters of the alphabet are on card 3?
L, M, N, O, P.
Any motifs that you think might give you some trouble, or are you comfortable with all of these? Okay. Good position. Nice stretch across your midline, keeping that left shoulder tucked in. Nice stretch, Sam.
1, 2,
1, 2.
1, 2, 1, 2.
All the way up.
1, 2, 1, 2.
Okay. See how you touched all the way up here? That's what we want for each of those. Okay. Next count.
1, two.
1, 2. 1.
2. 1, 2. 1.
Strong voice. 1.
2. 1, 2.
Okay, next count. I like how you're holding your position.
1, 2.
Up on 1, down on 2. So it's 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2.
1, 2. 1, 2.
There it is.
1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2.
Excellent finish. Very nice. Do you think you could hold the next 3 motifs in your head?
Yes.
All right. Let's do one more line.
So the next 4?
Would you like to challenge yourself?
Yes.
Okay, I like that you're rising to the challenge.
1, 2, 3, curve. 1, 2, 3, curve. 1, 2, 3, curve. One, 2 curve, 1, 2, 3 curve, 1, 2 curve, 1, 2, 3 curve. One, 2 curve, 1, 2 curve, 1, 2 curve, 1, 2 curve, 1, 2 curve.
Good. Make sure you're moving from your scapula, not your wrist or your elbow.
1, 2, 3 curve, 1, 2 curve, 1, 2, 3 curve, 1, 2, 3 curve, 1, 2 curve.
Take a step back and look at this last row. You've got what letter?
M, N, M, N,
That one should have been a what?
N.
An N instead. Okay, but excellent job holding those 4 motifs. Very nice working memory. All right, let's talk. What questions do you have, either about when the 8s were happening or the motifs?
I really don't have any questions on the chat. There were, if anyone just wants to unmute themselves and start some discussion, that would be great. The only question posted was some sensory concern about working with a chalkboard.
Yes, you want to make sure that you have the right kind of chalk, that there's no flex in it, if there's a screech. But part of what we work through with many of our students who do have those sensory issues is to gradually desensitize them. So maybe it's just a few components of rhythmic writing on the chalkboard and eventually building up to more and more.
Know who you play Saturday?
No, we know tomorrow.
Another question was, what about children who get dizzy or nauseated while they're
Yes.
doing it?
Yeah. One of the things that we do recommend our educational therapists do if there's been any history of seizures, if there's been concussion, traumatic brain injuries, that they do speak with the child's neurologist, or the parents do, letting them know about rhythmic writing before we start, just because it is such a cognitively integrative task that's very multisensory, has a high demand on working memory. We want to make sure that we're not triggering any systems that could trip that. There are students who do say it makes me dizzy or it hurts my eyes. Often what we'll see is students, some soft neurological signs. They'll curl their non-dominant hand, or they'll use their non-dominant hand to hang on to the ledge of the chalkboard. And those are all signs that just the system, the brain system isn't integrated yet. And we really want to, with practice, gradual practice, of build up that tolerance and that integration of systems so that they can handle this type of activity. But it's with time. What you saw with Sam, I believe he was either in his 2nd or 3rd year of educational therapy. But I would say within the first 4 weeks or so, we've introduced the change command as well as the variety of math. And then we're starting teaching our students, as you can see the card down there on the bottom right-hand ledge of the chalkboard, those motifs as they're practicing their cursive writing. The part that you didn't see, 2 other aspects of this technique, is after they've practiced the motifs, the repeated patterns, They then write the cursive letters. So you heard me ask him, Sam, what are the letters on card 3? And he said LMNOP, that you can see on the far right-hand side. He then writes on a line. He has to plan his spacing, the upper and lowercase cursive letters. Once the chalkboard activity is done, they then transition from a vertical space to a horizontal space where we have a large mat with a writing grip, where they're again practicing those large scapula, large gross motor movements to reinforce that motor memory of forming the letters before we build into those fine motor skills.
What is the difference between the 8 and the motifs?
Yes, so in the 8s, what students are developing, we have found many students with learning differences really struggle with laterality and directionality. So directionality is knowing left and right. Laterality is knowing my own left and right mirror images. So when students are doing the 8s, tracing the direction, they're getting the sense of which way is my hand going. It's my right hand, but it's going left. And when I change, at what point do I change? And now it's coming right. So we're teaching laterality and directionality. We're also building working memory because they're having to hold so many pieces. You know, we vary the language of math, the product of 6 and 3, the difference of 17 and 17. So they're having to process math while they're doing this motor activity. So it's very much working on working memory, processing speed. And then when we get to the motifs, this is the part that's directly linked to building the motor patterns for cursive writing, the spacing, the formation, and then the coordination that it takes to really, by your mouth, label what your hand is doing. So in that first motif, he was going up on 1, down on 2 for the letter L, the lowercase letter L. Can he coordinate that verbal action and direct his hand and say 1, 2, 1, 2? What's fascinating is you'll see students shift in their count. They start over here on their left, and they'll do 1, 2, 1, 2. And as soon as they hit midline, it becomes 2, 1, 2, 1. You hear an emphasis shift, and you just know there's a lot going on in the brain. I wish fMRIs had the capacity to allow that much movement going on to see what was happening in the brain. That's a long-term goal for us at NILD, to see a bird's eye view in the brain as rhythmic writing is happening. But from a behavioral standpoint, when we look at processing speed, working memory, changes to handwriting, we see movement and IQ scores as well as, achievement scores. So we know from a behavioral versus a functional physiological that changes are happening.
Will it affect a child with MS?
So affect is an interesting word. We have worked with individuals with cerebral palsy. We have worked with individuals who have had strokes, adults who have had strokes, children who have had strokes in utero, agenesis of the corpus callosum, where the corpus callosum is missing, so the left and the right sides of the brain don't have that bundle of fibers that's connecting them. MS is not one that I've heard a lot of ed therapists working with, not to say it hasn't happened, but what we do know, and this comes from my speech path friends, certainly that was a prior background of mine as well, we do know that some restoration and rewiring can happen when there's been insult or injury to the brain, so that different circuitry can take over and functionality can occur. And so we believe that with stimulation, some of that wiring and bypassing can happen. We've seen language come back for some of the individuals who've had strokes. For some individuals with cerebral palsy, we've seen some pretty interesting responses in language and processing. So we know transformation is occurring. We just haven't yet been able to measure it functionally with the brain imaging scans.
And can this be done with younger grades, students?
For sure. Yeah, so we can start with rhythmic writing as early as 5-year-olds. We have an early education program called Search and Teach. Now, the rhythmic writing is developmentally appropriate for them. So we have, for example, one example, the motifs, we will have dots that indicate their start and stop points. and the motions are less sophisticated because they're more developmentally appropriate. So they're more defined start and stops, you know, maybe it's boxes or hats that they're drawing, or diagonal lines. So yeah, it can start as young as 5. And like I said, I had the pleasure of working with a 68-year-old who was a functional illiterate, and he wanted to be able to read with his grandchildren. So he came to me a couple days a week, and we did rhythmic writing and some of our other techniques.
And does this process help with spelling?
You know, from the standpoint of the orthographic memory, no. From the standpoint of sequencing letters and not getting tripped up with the formation of letters as it relates to spelling, yes. But you know, for encoding purposes, there would be other techniques that we would do to more directly impact the spelling.
I just want to speak briefly about how fascinating rhythmic writing has been for my son, who is severely dyslexic. We launched with NILD when he was in 3rd grade. He's in 6th now. I mounted a chalkboard. I got the right chalk that was recommended for me to buy. And I watched this process and I thought, this is really odd. What are they doing? And this is a little boy that struggled to tie his shoes, really struggled with sequencing, days of the week, months of the year, really confused with left and right. He had a lot going on. His handwriting was illegible. And he's in 6th grade now. It truly reprogrammed his brain. He still struggles with dyslexia greatly, but his sequencing is there. He ties his shoes like a champ. His left and rights, he's got them nailed better than I do. And his handwriting is just stunning. It is beautiful penmanship. Cursive, he reads cursive better than he does print. He writes cursive better than he does print. It's really just been fascinating. At my elementary school here, my principal was kind enough to purchase a chalkboard, since chalkboards don't really happen in schools today. She went ahead and took funding and purchased one. And Connie Rizzer came out to my school and she trained my special ed teacher and our paraprofessionals in how to do rhythmic writing. So my son got to start his day in the special ed classroom every day doing rhythmic writing, which really kind of got his day going, woke his brain up, really made him ready to take in learning. Yeah, so I find it fascinating.
I love that story, Robin. It's precious, and it's repeated many times throughout the US and internationally. I can remember one of my ed therapists telling me, Kristen, I began to write in cursive on the board, and my student said, you know, Mrs. Daly, I can't read German. What are you writing? And she just said, well, it's cursive and it's in English. And so, you know, we've lost some of that art and science of cursive, but hopefully after tonight, you've seen the research that informs how it improves thinking and language and reading and comprehension, note-taking, retention. So there is a pendulum swing back. Even though Common Core standards took it out, there is a growing awareness and recognition of this thing that we thought was just mechanics and stylistic and personal actually really does have significant impact for thinking and learning.
And it's fairly easy to implement. I mean, the training that Connie came in and gave my SPED teachers, I mean, it was fairly quick and inexpensive. A chalkboard is fairly inexpensive. I mean, my dream would be that we could have that accessible for all special ed teachers. This is something that can be done in middle school and even high school. There's many kids who didn't get what was needed maybe in younger grades that would really benefit from something as simple as this in starting their day. Special ed teachers having a chalkboard again and learning the skills of rhythmic writing. It's a game changer. It really is.
So what, as we just look to finish up here tonight, we've talked about questions, there's resources here that are great resources for you, just some of that research. Zainer Blauser, however you say that, wrote a pretty interesting white paper, Handwriting in the 21st Century. Gives you some great additional resources and information, short little video that goes along with it. So if you're having difficulty convincing your administrator, a colleague as to the benefits of handwriting on thinking and learning, that's a good resource. Again, that Zainer Blauser, Handwriting in the 21st Century.
We had a question pop up about how can we get training in rhythmic writing? So I guess I would be curious if those asking are here local to the Meridian area or Treasure Valley. We happen to have an NILD school here.
You do. We love the collaboration with the Joshua Institute. Connie Risser is there. So talk with Robin, other members. Connie would be happy to work with you, to do some informal training, to get you to a place of being able to provide just a great technique and tool to develop your students' visual motor integration, handwriting skills. And again, I'm sure Robin, someone from your team, can share. Well, Connie was the presenter earlier this month in one of your...
Yeah, she presented on the 7th, covering dyslexia in special ed, small group instruction. But she is here in the Meridian area. She has a team. In fact, 2 of the members of NILD locally is with us tonight, Kim Zadel and Jordan Atnip. They are both educational therapists trained by Connie. But Connie does a lot of trainings that she offers out of her school. And she is willing to partner with Decoding Dyslexia in helping to offer more training. So please email me, those of you that would be interested in that, and I can find out on maybe setting up a time where we could do an in-house training with Connie at JI. Yeah, if you're in Boise and Nampa, and I'm seeing some comments here, it's not far. She's just on Cherry Street here in Meridian. So send me an email. Decoding Dyslexia has gotten a lot of great feedback from the webinars we've put on this month so far. The phonemic awareness webinar we held last week, also people were hoping for a part 2. So
good.
Yeah, it sounds like we've got some plans to make Kim and Jordan and continuing on with our training, which is what we enjoy doing, helping our teachers understand these type of kiddos and parents to know what they can be doing at home. I use rhythmic writing for my younger son, who is not diagnosed dyslexic, but really struggles with handwriting. And so Carter, my older son, now trains him how to do it. So it's really—
I love it. True confessions. We have a glass shower door and we have a 9-year-old, and sometimes I'll catch her in the shower and she's tracing the 888 with the, soap scum on the shower glass wall. And maybe that's not quite the right pattern that you're going in, but let's try it this way. So it can happen. We had parents would tell us, because rhythmic writing is typically done 5 to 6 days a week. So it's done twice with the ed specialist, the ed therapist, and then parents are trained in that component. So parents would say, well, what do we do when we go on vacation? And then some parents would come back and say, well, we were at the beach and in the sand, we were doing rhythmic writing and our motifs, or we were in the hotel and shaving cream on the mirror. So they get really committed to it because they do see those changes. The students see them, the parents see it, the teachers see it. It is remarkable. Where can you get the motif cards? Yeah, so the motif cards come with when you get the training. You get the chalk holder, you get the wire frame, which is what we use with the mat that helps with the particular pencil grip, and then the motif cards and the counts that go along with them. So that's all a part of the training packet.
So Kristen, if you have some little ones that would probably like to spend a half hour with the chalkboard and you need to move on, is it more important to continue on the chalkboard or to split it, say half with the chalkboard, half with the mat?
I would definitely spend more time on the chalkboard, especially with the littles, just because it really is reinforcing those nice, large, gross motor movements. Pick your battles. you may say, today we're going to spend more time on the chalkboard, and then the next session we'll spend more time on the mat. So give them some autonomy within the session. But the chalkboard, if I were to let anything go, I would let the mat go and spend more time on the chalkboard.
Let's see, further questions. I think just interest in training, it seems. Kristen, if there are, sorry, my dogs. If there's people with us tonight who are not local to get training from Connie in this area, where could a person go to learn more about NILD? And
yeah, so NILD's website is just www.nild.org. And we do virtual trainings. We have people all over the US, instructors. So if you've got a group of people in your area, 4 to 6 people, and you want an in-person instructor, we can send an in-person instructor to you. So check out our website. We've got an upcoming conference ourselves, and value our partnership with Decoding Dyslexia Idaho. And we share a similar mission. It's advocacy, it's awareness, it's equipping educators, getting the word out, because the students that we're working with and the teachers that are supporting them, it's critical that we're preparing the next generation of leaders and society members and what gifts they are. And we don't want to lose any of their gifts because of frustrations that come resulting from learning struggles or learning differences. And so you are transformational in the work that you're doing. If I could infuse a message of hope, don't underestimate the power of one believing adult that looks at a child, a student, and says, I see greatness in you. I believe that you're going to change, that you're thinking, that you're learning and you're growing. And I get to be a part of this process with you and helping you through it. It is transformational. And truly, you're changing the structure and function of the brain, because we are feeling human beings that think. And when we're connected socially and we're feeling safe and secure in learning environments that can be challenging, you're opening up new pathways. Neurochemicals, transmitters are producing the right ones so that anxiety, depression, nervousness isn't dampening down what needs to happen for working memory. So you're creating all of the systems and structures that will bring that transformation to the learners that you're working with.
well, let's see, it is just a few minutes over our time. I really appreciate it. It's hard to give up this time of night, and I really appreciate you being with us so late in the evening. It's 9:30 out there.
My pleasure. Absolute highlight of the day. Wouldn't want to be
Thank you
anywhere
much.
else.
Before we wrap it up, I'll just give everyone a quick last minute to unmute yourself and ask any final questions you might have.
I do want to thank Kristen, because she's done this many times with us, just come in, and she's always full of energy and full of knowledge. So if you can ever have her to do your training, you're very blessed to be there.
Right. Well, a lot of thank yous. So it looks like we can end tonight's webinar.
Okay. Thank you, Robin, and your team. It was my pleasure. We'll be in touch.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye. Are you going to hang with me a minute, Kim?